Hey there, everyone. Mike, I think I've got you now. How's it going?
It's going great. How you doing, Dustin?
Good. You ready to do a quick overview of Think for us?
I am ready. I got my
Awesome.
Watson avatar shirt
Oh man,
ready to go.
I didn't even wear a PMsquare shirt. I'm failing today.
Disappointing.
All right, so welcome everyone. Let me do a quick intro. My name is Dustin Adkison. I'm the managing partner here at PMsquare. I've got a bit of a technical background, so I'll see if I can keep this interesting as we talk to Mike about some of his takeaways from the recent Think conference. If you have questions, I'd love for you to post those in the chat, which I think is this way on YouTube. Would love to see your questions, and I'll make sure to bring those up, and we'll play a little stump the chump and see if we can get Mike with anything.
I'm sure you will.
Mike, Mike, you want to give a quick intro to yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Mike DeGeus. I'm over operations at PMsquare, including our professional services team. I have a technical background myself, so I've been doing data analytics, hands-on implementations for getting close to 20 years now. These days, I spend more of my time sort of enabling our team, trying to keep up on what's going on in the market, that sort of thing. But I still like to get my hands dirty and get my hands on the data myself and build some dashboards and visualizations and such. Data visualization is a passion of mine. So yeah, that's kind of the framework with which I approach this conference.
Nice. All right. So speaking of the conference, maybe if you want to start just by giving us an overview of like what is the conference, what's the purpose of it? I know it's a little bit different this year than it has been in years past. So maybe talk about what it used to be versus what it is today, and how maybe the audience for it's changed. And would love to hear your perspective on that from an attendee.
Sure. Right. So just looking before I actually attended the conference, just looking at the agenda, what was going to be happening there, it was pretty evident it was a little different because there weren't the preponderance of kind of technical sessions, deep dives into products, breakouts, all those sorts of things. A lot of that wasn't there. So even if you just looked at the agenda, it was sort of obvious that there was a little bit of a different audience or a different sort of vibe with this particular conference. Even though it was still called Think, it was actually sort of a different animal than Think in the past. So this was, I guess you'd say, it's a little more high level, a little more kind of business value focused as opposed to product feature focused. And it seemed like the audience sort of reflected that. It was more of folks, either they were on the business side or executives. There were definitely other IBM business partners there. There seemed to be a lot of folks who had traveled to Orlando. The conference was in Orlando. A lot of people that had traveled to Orlando from outside the United States as well. So nice sort of diversity of perspectives in that respect. So yeah, it was a little bit different. It seems like there's this IBM Tech Exchange conference later in the year, which is going to bring some of those elements that used to be part of Think to the table. So it's almost seems to be sort of broken out this year into two separate conferences. Obviously, we haven't done Tech Exchange yet, so I can't speak from personal experience, but based on what we understand and what we're seeing, that's sort of how it's shaping up.
So the one later, I think we're all attending that one. Is that one out in Vegas, or is that in Orlando again?
No, that one's in Vegas.
Yep. Vegas, all right. Get your walking shoes ready, I guess.
Right. No, we're excited about that one. It looks like there's going to be a lot of good energy around that one as well. Will be, probably pretty different. So more focus on specific products like Cognos Analytics, Planning Analytics, whereas this one was a little more big picture of sort of what IBM is doing, kind of thought leadership sort of approach.
Okay. Any highlights from it? Anything that you want to share that was kind of stood out to you as either general themes or like what? I feel like every year when IBM has one of these big conferences, they like to do like the big theme of the conference, the product of the month, their product of the year. So like what's the focus this year?
Yeah, so it turned out to be very much about this watsonx, sort of a new product, new offering, which we'll talk more about here in a minute, because like I said, a lot of the conference was about it. But that's sort of where I would start. There were a lot of sessions, a lot of keynotes, a lot of smaller sessions that were talking about this watsonx release, which wasn't something that was even announced beforehand. It was just announced at the conference. It was actually pretty secretive, apparently, which isn't necessarily IBM's normal approach to things, but they did a pretty good job of keeping this one under wraps. And essentially, it's a suite of tools that enable organizations to use sort of the current generation of AI capabilities. No real surprise there. Obviously, it's a hot topic. And sort of related to that, I thought was sort of a big deal was they announced a partnership with Hugging Face, which Hugging Face isn't necessarily a household name to everyone who might be following this. But yes, it is related to the Hugging Face emoji. If you look at their logo, it's actually a Hugging Face emoji.
Okay.
But yeah, it's not exactly the normal sort of IBM partner you might expect. It was actually founded originally by some French guys, and they built a chat bot that was aimed at teenagers. That was sort of where the company started, but it evolved into something a little different. So now they're basically a company that provides tools and a framework for using pre-trained AI models as a starting point for AI development, natural language, sort of AI development for organizations. And they've also created a real strong community around this development effort where folks can sort of create models and they can share them out to others. And so we'll loop back to it, I'm sure, and I can talk a little bit more about sort of where that plugs in with what IBM announced. But I thought that was pretty interesting. It was just a little unexpected to me for them to have that sort of partnership, but also I think pretty interesting, pretty exciting.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the only one, but I just had to look up what the hugging face emoji is. If you haven't seen it, it's like the magic fingers is what I'd call these. Like,
Yeah, it's one you have to be told is hugging to figure out that it's hugging.
yeah, I couldn't really tell
Yeah,
what that was.
this doesn't not exactly how I hug usually.
Yeah, it's awesome. All right. So you said a lot of it's really AI focused. Do you feel like that's in response to like all the press around ChatGPT and Bard and like all the AI products right now? Do you think that's something that when you also say it's like a tool to encompass all those, is it like is it encompassing ChatGPT or is it its own AI tool? Like what? Maybe tell me a little bit more about how that fits in.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I will say that when I first started hearing some of this there, I was like, oh, is this just sort of like IBM felt like they had to do a conference around AI because of Chat GPT and all that. But as I listened more, I started thinking about it more and just referenced some of the things I really already knew about IBM. I mean, this is the company that created Watson,
Yeah.
which was really it was large language models before there was large language models. I was doing a lot of the things that we're seeing today, coming to kind of mainstream. IBM was doing a long time ago. So that was the first part that I had to sort of check myself and be like, okay, this is sort of IBM's sweet spot. And then second of all, it turns out this Watson X they announced, which at first when I first just heard the announcement, I was like, oh, well, is this just are they sort of repackaging some stuff they already had to kind of be like, oh, now we have a new AI offering here to tap into the Chat GPT hype. But it turns out they've actually been developing this for the last year and a half. So it's not like large language models haven't been around for a year and a half, but obviously it wasn't a real popular thing. It was just late last year that it kind of came into the mainstream. So it's not like this is just a reactionary sort of thing that IBM cranked out. This is really something that's been in the works. And fortunately, they've been tuned in to what's been happening in that world, how AI is progressing. And I think they were sort of forward thinking and seeing that this was about to hit an inflection point, and we're sort of ready to go to market with something.
Yeah.
I did feel like it was helpful there, though, that there was a little bit of just kind of clarification or disambiguation around some of the terms that I've been hearing as they pertain to generative AI and all this. So there's actually I have a few visuals that I'll reference to the course, though, so I want to keep it informal, but it's also helpful to be able to look at something together, I think, to talk about some of these things. So I thought it was really helpful just to kind of disambiguate between things like foundation model, generative AI, some of these things. I've been using them sort of interchangeably. Like, I don't know, Dustin, I think probably you did. It's hard to remember a few months back, but I know I at first was just sort of like, yeah, Chat GPT and Chat GPT like AI. I didn't really know the right terminology for it. And I've been trying to figure it out. So
LLM then, or
yeah, LLM's part of it. But so a foundation model is really just it's a large AI model that's trained on a bunch of data that's unlabeled data, and that can be that's really serves as the foundation, if you will, for a lot of other AI. So these have broad capabilities. They can be adapted to a bunch of different, more specific purposes. you can build other things on top of it. And this is in contrast to other sorts of AI systems in the past or that still exist now, just for different purposes, which are really trained for a very specific purpose. And then, so a large language model, that's the one that's gotten the most attention, but that's just a particular type of foundation model that's good at understanding and generating text, which isn't really a distinction that I had totally made before. And then generative AI could really refer to anything, any sort of AI that creates new content. Like we've been using ChatGPT to create, like have it actually write stuff out for us. So it's generating some sort of new content in that sense.
I had to expand that to make sure it didn't say general AI, because I was already thinking about my future robot overlords. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thankfully, we're not quite there yet. And then transformer was one sort of new term to me that I hadn't heard as much, but that's sort of the intelligence or the architecture that exists within a foundation model that sort of like does the stuff that leads to this generative AI. So I don't know, that was helpful to me. Probably some of you folks listening have already figured out all this, all these different terms, but to me they were sort of jumbled in my mind a little bit. It helped me sort of figure out a little bit more what each one actually means.
So I guess where does watsonx fall into those categories then? Because I know I think ChatGPT, often people are figuring out ways to monetize that. I'm sure IBM wants to monetize whatever they do around AI. That's why they're in business. But I know ChatGPT, it's often looked at like, how do we embed this? How do we use this like to build out better code? Like, what's the? Oh, you got a slide for it. Okay, I'll pause and let you go.
let me share this first, I'll just preface with some of these slides. I mean, a lot of this stuff it might seem a little salesy, and it's not my intention to sell folks on watsonx. I'm just learning about it myself. But I do want people to understand that, this is a recap of the conference. So this is sort of the messaging that IBM had around this new release. And, I haven't been able to use it myself yet. It's not actually available yet. So I can't give you my hands-on experience with it. So I'll share a little bit about IBM's messaging and, give some thoughts that I have. But before we dive into some of your questions, Dustin, I think it's helpful just to kind of understand a little bit more about kind of what it is, how they're packaging it or how they're messaging it. So it's made up of these three components, which the naming is kind of funny. Each one's a dot something. watsonx.ai, watsonx.data, watsonx.governance. So the AI piece is to train, validate, tune models. The data piece is to get the data ready to feed into those models, essentially. We'll definitely want to talk more about that in a few minutes. The data piece, I think, is sort of the most applicable to the stuff that PMsquare does, and probably a lot of our folks who might be listening to this or watching this do as well. And then there's the watsonx.governance piece, which I think is pretty interesting to talk about. This one's maybe the most sort of ambiguous or fuzzy to me right now, but I think it's really interesting how it was framed there at the conference. I think it's worth us sort of circling back to talk about that more. But so these are the three components of it. All together, they make up what IBM's calling watsonx overall. So, just to talk, I want to talk a little bit more about like the AI and governance pieces first, and then we can spend a little bit more time on the data, because like I said, I think that's the most relevant. But yeah, the AI piece, this is really for AI builders to tune and deploy, models, both sort of more traditional models as well as new generative AI stuff that's powered by foundation models. That was a big part of the conversation, is just this foundation model aspect and sort of how key these are to generating business value. And so, there's these foundation model libraries which are built in to this offering. So again, remember, foundation model, it's the foundation for more AI stuff you want to build. So it's kind of a shortcut, if you will. It's stuff that in the past you have to train like all this, like, millions of rows of data in order to get something meaningful. When you start with a foundation model, you're like a good portion of the way there, and you can start kind of adding value on top of the foundation. So that's sort of the approach here. There's a prompt lab, which I think we've all over the last few months learned a lot more about what prompting means. It's not just a drop down anymore, what I used to think of prompt as it related to data and analytics, but now it's sort of this natural language. How do you coax the answers that you need out of an AI system? So that's a piece of it. And then, kind of a tuning element to just make sure that things are honed in and you're getting sort of exactly the types of responses that you're expecting. Dustin, is this making sense? I don't want to just
a little bit. I've got a few questions about it. So like reading it, particularly the use cases, like those are the use cases I hear about ChatGPT is Like what makes this stand out? Why is this different from just using something that's probably more well known right now? And I think your point earlier too about how IBM kind of at one point was the leader in AI with Watson, but has kind of fallen out of that space.
Right.
Is this playing catch up, or is there something new here that stands out as the way that this would differentiate from something like a Chat GPT?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and I think it actually is pretty different.
Okay.
So one of the things that was really impressed upon me as I was kind of ingesting all this information was this idea that like how do you actually get the most business value out of all this stuff? Like as I had learned more about ChatGPT and started playing with a little bit myself, it got my gears turning about like how do we use, how does PMsquare use this, or what are great sort of business use cases for taking advantage of this. Obviously, it opens up all sorts of opportunity, but I kept thinking of it in terms of like how do I plug into Chat GPT? Like how do I use the Chat GPT API, which I think a lot of companies have been looking at. I mean, I know like Microsoft, for instance, is integrating Chat GPT into their various 365
Yeah.
services. There's different ways companies are trying to integrate that stuff in, but a lot of times it's almost like a bolt on. Like how can we add this natural language stuff to the things that we're already doing to make some things a little bit easier? Add some shortcuts. And IBM's approach is different. I mean, you definitely can do that, and you can utilize some of these tools for that. Uh, but what they want to enable companies for is taking these foundation models and then saying, okay, what's your core competency as an organization? Now start adding that on top of the foundation model. So just as an example, for PMsquare, we have a lot of knowledge around Cognizant analytics, planning analytics, the cloud, data services in the cloud, et cetera. And we actually have that in a few different sources in our Slack, on SharePoint, et cetera. So we have a lot of this information. We, in theory, we might talk about this more in the future, Dustin, when we actually do it, but you can potentially take this information, you can essentially feed it in on top of a foundation model, and you can actually pretty quickly get to something that could be pretty useful in terms of being a way to utilize that knowledge that's sort of out there in various places, as opposed to if we wanted to start from scratch from that, we probably wouldn't have enough data, first of all, and it would take a lot more effort to prepare it for any sort of AI use. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I know we talked about doing a similar use case in the past using like Watson Assistant and maybe like a RPA combination of solutions. I'm still curious how this differs, but maybe you'll have some ideas on that in a bit.
Yeah, if we have some time, then we can kind of loop back a little bit more and try to tie some of those other pieces together as well.
Yeah, and so
RPA wasn't really a focus at this conference in particular, but I mean, it's still obviously it's a huge thing and can definitely be an enabler connected to this. And actually, there is one piece which we might have a chance to talk about briefly, which is called Watson Orchestrate, which actually does kind of more directly tie in the RPA stuff now that I think about it.
Is it watsonx.orchestrate or is it just Watson Orchestrate?
I think it's just Watson Orchestrate. It's not part of Watson X technically.
Okay. Can we go back to all the watsonx stuff that you had a slide on?
Yeah. Do you want to go back to look at that visual in particular, or just kind of keep that conversation going?
I want to see that visual one more time.
Sure.
There we go. Okay. So like, it looks like these are all tied together. Is this like one solution, or are these multiple solutions? Because I know sometimes the marketing will make things look more joined together than they actually are in real life. Did you get a feel if these are all like, hey, you get all these things and you have to use all, or do these piece out? And if so, like, where do you see the biggest impact across these?
Yeah, I would say that some of those specifics are not totally clear yet. This product is scheduled for GA release, as I understand it, in July. So it's not actually not out there yet, but it is close. It's not just it's not presentationware. It's an actual product that's coming out in a couple months. I did see some demonstrations of some of the stuff, particularly in watsonx.data. I think based on what I saw, that probably will integrate pretty closely with the watsonx.ai. The governance piece I mentioned is a little more ambiguous to me. Like conceptually, it's very compelling. How that actually fits in, is that like a related studio or something, if you will, to their products, isn't totally clear yet. I know that does sort of tie in with Watson Knowledge Catalog, which is an existing product that's out there that seems to be kind of related or a piece of the governance suite overall. But it's not 100% clear yet exactly how it's all going to fit together.
Okay. Any of these stand out to you as one that would maybe tie well with some of the things that PMsquare is known for today, whether that's Cognos, Planning Analytics, cloud services, predictive?
Yeah, let me jump over some of this because I don't want to run out of time.
Yeah.
Actually, before we jump to that, Dustin, let me just real quick kind of, because I mentioned what watsonx.ai was. Let me just say what the .governance is.
Yeah.
Aside from just sort of being data governance in general, which I understand, but this isn't just data governance. It is supposed to be governance over AI more as a whole, as opposed to just the data piece, which I think sort of probably resonates with a lot of folks these days because a lot of people have played with the chat GPT and you've seen the hallucination that can take place where you're just getting answers that it's very confident in but are entirely untrue, it's entirely made up, or the information is out of date, etc. And so that was something that to me I thought was very compelling, just around the story around this governance offering is how important it is to have governance around AI in order to be useful for business. Like, it's one thing if you just want to sort of play with it, do some interesting things, have it be a little bit of a shortcut to writing an email or something. But if you actually want to operationalize it in some way in your business, it has to be reliable, governed, trustworthy. And so again, I would say I'm a little short on specifics right now around exactly how that's going to work. But that message to me did really resonate. And I think that if IBM can help solve some of the problems around the trustworthiness of this type of AI, then I think they could have something that's a hit on their hands, essentially, something that would be really useful to business.
I was gonna say that may be the best value I've heard, because if you think about a lot of the things with ChatGPT and Bard, it's I did an example where I asked both what's the value of a tool like those, and when I asked Bard, it was all about, well, you should still use Google, and actually called out Google, so not exactly unbiased in its response. So
didn't point you to Bing, huh?
No, believe it or not. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So that's the concept of the governance piece. I think it's super interesting. But to go back to more what you were asking, the data piece, I think, is what most resonates and ties into some of the things we're more familiar with. So I thought it'd be worth talking about this for a couple minutes.
Before you go on to that, I'm going to throw out a little activity for our people that are in the chat. If you all want to share some of your better ChatGPT or Bard or AI experiences, or maybe funny ones, it'd be great to see those at the end of this. We can talk through some when we get to the end. I know Paul Mendelson, who I see on there, had one where he could not convince ChatGPT like a certain letter existed in a string. So could be a fun thing to see some of those.
Those things always encourage me a little bit that humans still have some advantages.
We're not going to be overthrown yet.
All right, cool. So yeah, let's talk for a couple minutes about the watsonx.data. I think this is really interesting. So you might see in some places, if you look it up online, where it sort of sounds like it's just a feeder for AI and ML. Once I learned a little more about it, I see that in some places it's positioned that way, but I think it's has more broad applicability than being just for that purpose. As the description here actually says, all data analytics, AI workloads, and all data analytics, I think, is key there. At its core, it's sort of a lakehouse offering, which is something we've been talking about for a little while, so probably isn't new to a lot of folks watching this. And so not to belabor this, because I know many of you are familiar with this sort of evolution, but IBM spent some time at the conference talking about how the data warehouse, the data lake, the cloud data warehouse, these are all an evolution of technologies. They've all served a particular purpose. I think most of us are pretty familiar. Data warehouse, more structured data, more business analytics use cases there, whereas a data lake is more served the AI, ML use cases. And then you have newer things like the cloud data warehouse, which improved on stuff from the data warehouse in the past, but still had its own limitations, like getting locked into a particular vendor like Snowflake or something, how do you get all your data there? And then so this concept of the lake house came about, which is sort of a hybrid between the data warehouse and the data lake, which can help mitigate some of the limitations of both. But at the same time, it's not a magic bullet either. It still has some limitations. And so IBM is sort of positioning this watsonx.data as like a second generation lakehouse. So they talk about some of the limitations of what they are calling first generation, like having a single query engine. Got to basically need to be deployed in the cloud. You can't really do it on premise. Again, these are generalizations. I'm sure you can find ways around some of these things. And kind of minimal governance. The metadata capabilities can be a little bit lacking. And so they're seeking to address some of these problems and what they're positioning as sort of a second generation lakehouse. So pretty interesting. And obviously, we see lakehouses as something that's very useful for sort of general data and analytics, not just for machine learning and AI.
I'm so confused by this slide, Mike. If you go back, is that saying that this is what this watsonx would become? Is that middle blue area, or is it calling out that this is still limited?
I think this is more just trying to paint the picture a little bit more of the one before this had sort of a different visual of it, but paint the picture of what the differentiations are between these different sorts of technologies.
That makes sense.
As opposed to say they're specifically one or the other. I mean, the watsonx.data has a lot in common with the traditional, I should say traditional lakehouse. It's only been around for a few years, but what we know is a lakehouse. But then they're trying to address some of the limitations of it as well.
Got it.
So again, this one's real salesy, but again, I just wanted to throw it up so you sort of get an idea of how IBM is messaging this, sort of how they're going to market with this offering. So, get all your data. Again, all your data to me is key. This isn't just data for AI purposes through a single point. It's IBM. Hybrid cloud is sort of part of the message for sure. So on-prem, in the cloud, across various clouds, get up and going quickly. And then cost reduction is actually a big part of the story. And I can explain a little bit more about that here. So the thing that's most compelling about this to me is this idea of multiple engines, which was referenced a second ago. This was sort of a new idea to me, is that you can have, well, I should say it's totally a new idea. I mean, we've been doing some of this stuff for a while, but the way they've sort of packaged it together is new. So you have, nobody wants to be replicating their data, right? You don't want to be moving it around. You don't want to be making copies of it. And so the architecture they put together kind of sits on this foundation. I'll show a better visual in a minute, but sits on a foundation of where your data itself is sort of sitting just in object storage, like Amazon S3, something like that. And then things are sort of decoupled so that you can choose the right sort of query engine to hit that data. That's sort of the big picture, the way I would sum it up. And so up here in the top right of this slide, it sort of gives a very high level of that, where Spark is one particular engine that's used more for AI machine learning use cases. Presto is one that's a little more conducive to like analytics, dashboards, and such. And so it hits this shared metadata layer and then goes back to the object storage underneath and pulls back the data that's needed. So pretty interesting. And that's where some of that cost savings can come in, because you use the right engine for your particular use case rather than trying to leverage something or move the data around, make copies of your data. Those sorts of things tend to be costly, particularly in the cloud.
Yeah, and so probably looking at this from a perspective of some of our clients and how we maybe have lived historically in the Cognos space, is this just then used as a data source for Cognos? Are there ever other use cases that would tie this into more of IBM's analytics engine or planning engine or predictive engine?
It's a little hard to say at this point. There were some clues, I would say, when I was there about how it might be tied in to Cognos, like being able to query this, yes, but not just as like a data source for a data module or a framework manager model, but actually being able to work directly from Cognos to use natural language and query this system, which is pretty interesting. Because again, this could be pulling together data from all sorts of sources. There was some stuff about showing how, in addition to using this to generate AI, this also has AI baked into it in some ways that I thought were more interesting than some of the things I've seen in the past. sometimes the AI baked in stuff to me, it's like it does a worse job than I would if I took 5 minutes to do it. Whereas this, it was pretty cool because it showed it generating metadata for a table based on analysis of not only like the column names and the data types, but also looking at the data within those columns as well and figuring out like what actually was probably in those columns, and then giving more business friendly names, like a name for the table, and so you could actually point it at a data source. You could generate a bunch of metadata, and then if Cognos could read that natural language, it's pretty interesting. It's a way to maybe shortcut some things. Again, it's probably not going to replace an architect going in and creating a data module for certain purposes, but to be able to answer certain business questions a lot more quickly. It's a pretty interesting concept.
Did you get a feel for like how it's stored and like if it's something that Cognos could access? Is it stored like in like what format?
Yeah, so let me show another visual here. Yeah, this one I think is the best visual for talking about this. So I mentioned that kind of S3 is being the foundation. So S3 is just, it's object storage. It's basically, it's like a flat file. So it's kind of a standard at this point. But the problem with S3 is that there's no metadata around anything, so it's kind of hard to work with in terms of if you want to create analytics on top of it. So then there's this like open table format that can sit on top of it, and so that's something like Iceberg. Iceberg is really the standard that they've most settled on and are most pushing as part of watsonx. I think there was a logo on the previous slide, and so Iceberg essentially puts some metadata around your flat files that are stored in S3, so that you can actually make use of them, so that you can query them more effectively. So that's sort of that data catalog layer that we talked about a minute ago.
What's the logo on the left? The triangle that says like Avho or something.
I thought about it before the session that you were going to ask me that, and I don't know. I can't read it. I'm not sure what that is.
All right.
It's probably another Apache. Apache has so many projects and they each get their own logos. It might be another Apache project. Someone in the comments correct us. I'm sure someone recognizes it. And there's then at the top, the Presto and Spark have been mentioned a couple places. I think that's where they're starting, along with probably some IBM proprietary engines like Netezza. I saw Netezza represented as well, DB2. I don't know where this is going. Like maybe there's going to be a dozen different engines. But again, pretty cool because you can, and let me actually, one more visual I thought was sort of helpful for this, and it's a little bit small. But this is actually showing like in the application, or at least the current representation of the application, what this could look like, where you have these different engines, like Presto, Spark, here's showing the teaser like I mentioned a second ago. And so like this Spark one, it's tying into 3 different catalogs that are then going back to 3 different data sources and pushing it all up. And then like the Presto engine can get at the same data through like one of the same catalogs. I don't know, this is a very like flexible sort of system without having to move data, or, so much data duplication, moving data around. And I haven't seen it quite like this decoupling. I think we've been seeing through things like the modern data stack. So it's not totally new. Like a lot of these concepts are not new, but kind of pulling it all together the way that they're doing it, it's compelling to me. If IBM delivers on this and the product comes out and it actually works as they're sort of demonstrating it, I think this could be pretty interesting.
Awesome. So I'm going to switch gears off of watsonx because that's been what we talked about mainly. But if anyone has questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll come back and answer questions about it. But I think like what else was covered? Was it 100% watsonx? Were there other topics that got touched on? I know looking at the agenda ahead of time, we didn't see any product specific sessions. So
right.
I don't know if there are other products besides watsonx talked about, or general themes that you saw that would be worth sharing.
Yeah, there were a few other things. Like sustainability was a pretty big topic of conversation, and
okay.
One thing that was kind of useful, I thought, in the way they were approaching all of these topics is that they were all related back to data. So it wasn't just like sustainability in a general sense, but talked about data a little bit. So here's just a visual around that I thought was sort of compelling. That sort of depressing, kind of compelling, but in 2 years, sort of the public consumer trust in the sustainability statements that companies are making has really plummeted pretty dramatically. So that's a little bit sad. Basically says that people don't think companies are really genuine, I guess, about their sustainability initiatives. but there was some data shared around this, which I thought was interesting. So like 95% of companies have made these ESG, environmental, social governance propositions, but only 10% have made significant progress. So no wonder the public's trust is dropping. But what was most compelling, I think, just to us, is that the problem that was cited most often is a lack of data. So really not knowing where to invest. So, there's a little bit of a skeptic in me that says, hey, is that really the problem? Is you don't have enough data to know where to invest? Are there other things getting in the way? But I'm sure for at least, a healthy dose of companies that is a genuine issue, is not having data, not knowing, where to go with these sorts of initiatives. So I think that presents an opportunity for us in our field.
Got it. Like, where does IBM fit into this? Like, how are they going to build that trust? Like
well, I mean, obviously, a lot
or?
of what we're talking about here with watsonx is around delivering data that's trusted, and being able to govern your AI. There was another stat shared that 66% of IT pros are trying to use AI to further these ESG initiatives. So it obviously sort of all fits together, like the governed AI, the accessibility of data. These can all be pieces of the puzzle to helping make more progress in terms of sustainability.
Got it.
Another thing that I thought was really interesting was quantum. And I'm not going to go into any sorts of depth here. I would be way out of my depth pretty soon. But I did think that it was sort of interesting to think about conceptually. This is something that probably a lot of us that are in the tech space hear about in the back of our minds. We know this sort of quantum's coming, and maybe we occasionally think about how it might impact us. I didn't realize there's also animation here, but where do we start to have to really think about this more? And IBM trying to put together sort of a, if not timeline, at least sort of a progression of sort of how things are going and what companies should be doing, I thought was useful. So, what can we do today, given where quantum is actually at? Just real high level, what this is showing is you can start sort of taking inventory of your data that is sensitive. That's a good place to start, so that you're ready when more quantum technology is available to start securing that data. Because, and this is something that I don't like thinking about, but hackers are already gathering data that is encrypted with today's current encryption standards, so that they can hack it later once quantum technology is available. So it's not like oh yeah, we'll all need to have more secure mechanisms back when eventually when quantum's comes to the forefront. It's like, no, if someone steals your stuff now that's encrypted with 256-bit RSA, whatever, I'm not an encryption expert, if they can actually just have that sitting over on a hard drive, later they can go and they can unencrypt it once quantum's available to them. So anyway, not to scare people, but like the point is, start thinking about like what you have that's sensitive, so that as soon as the technology is available, you can actually start to use more advanced sort of encryption approaches, so that it will be quantum safe. That's the gist of it.
So can you give me a very, very high level of what quantum is?
Probably not.
Okay.
Not in any meaningful way. I mean, it's just a far more robust way of processing. So certain computational problems can be solved like exponentially faster than they could using current technology.
Okay.
So as far as giving you an explainer about why that, like how that is, that would be beyond me. But that's the end outcome of it, is that things that maybe in the past would take like a password or an encryption algorithm that would take 2,000 years to crack could be cracked in like 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So quantum equals very fast compute.
Right, for certain types of computational problems.
Okay.
Let's see, anything else? Oh, so I mentioned Watson Orchestrate. So just real briefly about what that is. There's this concept of a digital employee, which sounds a little bit dystopian. There's a few dystopian themes perhaps in this. But it's kind of putting together some of these technologies in a way that actually allows people to focus more on high value things, and some of the things that are more routine in your daily lives. You can have this, robotic assistance. This is where maybe ties in a little bit more to RPA, like you mentioned earlier, Dustin. And I think this is just sort of an interesting concept. They showed a short demonstration video of what this could look like. And I just grabbed this slide here because I had a screenshot. I thought it helped sort of drive home the concept. Where you're talking with natural language, hey, I'm trying to get something done here. They're focusing this first on HR. And this is something that I know I've struggled with. It's very time consuming to do all the components of, you got to write up a job description, you got to post the job description, you got to schedule interviews, you got to talk to these people, you got to do follow-ups, you want to send out a notice to people who you're not moving forward with. You got to, just all these steps to actually get someone from identifying a potential candidate to onboarding them. And that's sort of the initial focus of Watson Orchestrate, although it can be used for all sorts of purposes in the future. So this screenshot shows how this sort of ties into different systems that would facilitate those things. And that's sort of showing its capabilities. Like you would just talk in natural language to it or type in natural language, and then it would leverage these components that it's tied into so it can go out and it can do something on LinkedIn, for instance, or create this job requisition in SAP. And you can plug in just eventually there'll be hundreds or thousands of these different components that can plug in, and they all operate from a natural language perspective. And so you don't have to know like exactly all the ins and outs of the APIs or anything or map them. You just interact with natural language and it can do stuff in those systems. So I thought that was a pretty interesting concept. It seems like it has legs, and whether it will be, in the very near future or a little bit further down the line, I could definitely see something like this being used pretty frequently.
Oh, so I'll say as someone who's probably more overwhelmed than anything by all the topics you covered today, like how would you recommend someone get started if they're watching today and they have interest in knowing more about whether it's quantum technology and quantum computing or Watson Orchestrate or watsonx?
Well, there's a lot of places to go, but I would say just from the perspective of like this conference, the keynotes are online, and there's maybe like 8 different keynotes, and they all have. I didn't get to see all of them when I was there. I think I saw 5 or 6 of them, but there's one that really stood out to me, which was the one that's titled Generative AI, and we can post the link in either the chat here or on our blog or something, but it's easy to find, so you can just Google IBM Think 2023. But anyway, the generative AI one was super compelling. That has one of the founders of Hugging Face there to talk a little bit about just what that partnership looks like. That was where they talked, right? That was where they talked about some of those concepts that I mentioned around just like not just plugging in ChatGPT, but how you can really get value out of generative AI for your business. So I thought there was some good like thought leadership in that session. So I'd recommend that. I would also say like the first 10 minutes of the one called AI for Business is definitely worthwhile. The whole session is worthwhile, but if you're short on time, check out the first 10 minutes. That's Rob Thomas doing that presentation. He gives a good intro to watsonx, and Rob Thomas is also just a great presenter.
Yeah, he is.
I'm always amazed how he never stumbles over a single word. He just presents everything very smoothly.
We've got a great keynote from him on our channel here somewhere from Bacon 2020.
That's right. Yeah, he's great.
Mike, I forget that you're not a sales guy, so I throw you a softball and you just fumble it. But you can also reach out to PMsquare for help with any of these things for anyone watching. All right,
we're very helpful.
I think we're well past time. So any parting thoughts or anything else that you'd like to share, just whether it's about the conference or anything that you'd want to share about anything coming up for us, or
the one thing that I thought would be worth mentioning is just that I've been hearing some rumblings about a major new IBM Analytics release that's probably coming out in the pretty near future. So don't have any more details to share now, but I would definitely stay tuned to this channel and just in sort of PMsquare in general, because we are very on top of those sorts of things. So as soon as we can share information, we will, and we'll share it in some decent depth. We'll get you a first look as soon as there is a first look to be had.
Awesome. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming and attending our Think recap. If you haven't done it, I'd love for you to like, I think is here, and subscribe, which is maybe over here somewhere, to this channel. You can also find us on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter. And if you ever just need to contact us, we're available at contact@pmsquare.com. We've got a lot of great sources on our website as well if you want to contact us about any specific things. And thanks, Mike, for the great overview of Think. Excited to chat with you over there in Phoenix. So I'm miles away here in Chicago, but we'll wrap up there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dustin.